Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. This is a truly global enterprise. We have participants from here in Western Australia, but also from Canberra, from Strasbourg in France, from Berlin, from the UK, and we'd like to welcome you all to this joint Perth USAsia Centre Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung launch of a joint report on Europe's Indo-Pacific embrace, global partnerships for regional resilience. And we've got hard copies available as well, but most of you should have seen the electronic version. Before we formally kick off, allow me to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Australia and the Perth USAsia Centre here in Western Australia are situated on the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And as is our tradition, we'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. The topic at hand today, it could not be more timely. There is an intense level of interest in the Indo-Pacific as a region and in developments within the Indo-Pacific. And in the past several weeks alone, there's been a fierce debate, particularly about the role of Europeans in this region. The Perth USAsia Centre over the course of the last 4 or 5 years has done a number of reports looking at the roles of individual countries and their specific approaches to this region. We started with a report on India in the Indo-Pacific, then looked at one from Indonesia's perspective, from Vietnam's perspective, from Japan's perspective, and most recently from South Korea's perspective. And it became increasingly apparent that to really understand how dynamic this region has become, and how important the multitude of different relationships in this region are, that we really needed to understand the emerging European Indo-Pacific strategy. And so in that regard, we could not think of a better partner for this endeavor than to work together with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung, and in particular with their office here in Canberra. I was very fortunate, together with several of our panelists here, to travel to Berlin in 2018 for a conference that the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung organized on the Indo-Pacific. And that has followed with some rather dynamic developments in terms of a broader European view of the Indo-Pacific and country-specific strategies coming out of the United Kingdom, of Germany, of France, the Netherlands, and others. And so we think the release of this report is extremely timely, and we're delighted to be presenting it to you today. Our opening, I'm looking around to see if we've got Ambassador Fisher online yet. I don't believe we do yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to kick off. We're very fortunate to have with us Mr. David McAllister, who's the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs for the European Parliament, coming to us from Strasbourg, France, I believe. I'm going to turn first to David for some initial opening remarks, and then hopefully by that time we'll have the German ambassador online with us. David, over to you.
Yes, thank you, and good morning here from Strasbourg in France. My name is David McAllister, and I chair the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, and I'm in Strasbourg because this is this month's plenary session. I would like to first of all thank the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung and the Perth USAsia Centre for this, how can I put it, very timely discussion. As you all know, the European External Action Service, that is the so-called Foreign Ministry of the European Union, has presented just on the 16th of September a new EU strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, and we all observed the new partnership between the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, followed by the, as we here call it, submarine crisis. Clearly, the Indo-Pacific, as you just mentioned, is gaining strategic significance for everyone in the world, also here in the European Union. Now, from a European perspective, this region is for us a source of new opportunities, but also geopolitical challenges. It creates 60% of global GDP and about 2/3 of global growth. It is the second largest destination for EU exports and home to 4 out of our top 10 EU trading partners, namely China, India, South Korea, and Japan. If you look at the two areas together, the European Union and the Indo-Pacific, hold over 70% of the global trade in goods and services, as well as about 60% of foreign direct investments, and moreover, functioning supply chains, financial flows, and mutual reliance on market demand creates interdependencies of strategic importance also for the prosperity and stability of us here in the European Union. In parallel to the economic strength, the geopolitical importance of the region is clearly on the rise. Current dynamics in the Indo-Pacific stimulate intense geopolitical competition and tensions in trade and supply chains, but also in technological, political and security fields. At the same time, the stability of the region has been at risk from authoritarian regimes suppressing democratic principles and human rights. For us in Europe, and we share this view definitely with our friends in Australia, the geopolitical significance and economic growth in the Indo-Pacific is based on its openness, its stability, and its shared security. In this respect, the EU's interest is similar to so many other countries in the region to keep the regional order open and to keep it rules-based. From my point of view, the new EU Indo-Pacific strategy, which the High Representative presented, as I mentioned, on the 16th of September, makes an important step in this direction. It calls to increase our engagement in the region based on a cooperative and on an inclusive approach. This means to work with our partners in the Indo-Pacific and beyond in order to respond to emerging dynamics that are affecting regional stability and security. To achieve these goals, the EU needs to diversify and to deepen its partnerships and avoid unilateral dependencies. The EU approach, from my point of view, in the Indo-Pacific should be pragmatic and flexible. We need to build our cooperation with different partners according to specific policy areas where we can find common ground based on shared principles, values, and mutual interest. At the same time, we shouldn't compete or force countries to take sides, but strengthen their resilience to common global challenges. In doing so, a commitment to our values and interest needs to remain strong. Therefore, and I'm very principled here, it is in our interest as European Union to deepen cooperation with democratic, like-minded partners in the region, such as Japan, South Korea, India, New Zealand, and of course, Australia. In order to achieve more meaningful impact, we will also need to find common ground for cooperation with the United Kingdom and the United States. Although the last experience from Afghanistan, or the already mentioned AUKUS partnership and the submarine deal brought us down to earth, the European Union should be ready to build flexible cooperation based on shared priorities such as maritime security, climate change, or human rights, just to name three. In order to get a closer strategic coordination of democratic market-based partners, the European Union is also well placed to promote regional multilateral structures such as Asean. Multilateral agreements are the most effective way to make progress in various policy areas, from environment protection to rules-based trade. After strengthening the EU-ASEAN strategic partnership, the ASEAN members are paying more attention to trade, investment, and sustainable development, but also to our geostrategic actions as European Union. The overreaching engagement in the region should not preclude cooperation with China. While assuming conflicts of interest and differences in values, the European Union, from my point of view, should be open to possible cooperation in Beijing in areas of common interest. Yet, inclusivity should not lead to appeasement. We ought to pursue a multi-faced engagement with China that is principled, practical, and pragmatic. Or as a colleague of mine in the European Parliament once put it, with China, we should cooperate where possible, compete where needed, confront and contain where necessary. In the Indo-Pacific, and in the framework of our new Indo-Pacific strategy, this means that our goal should be to work with China in areas where we have an interest to cooperate, such as climate change, and to work with allies in areas where we share concerns on the substance of Chinese actions. At the same time, we should be ready to provide economic, political, and strategic alternatives to our partners which face power asymmetry when Beijing is dictating the terms of our relations. For us also here in Europe, and we follow this very carefully, for example, China is using the Silk Road Initiative to extend its global influence through proposing global standards and norms, which shapes industrial policy, in particular by promoting state-owned companies. Yet it is not enough just to criticize this policy, but we should be able to provide alternatives. Clearly, connectivity is turning into a primary arena of geopolitical competition, especially in your part of the world. So this means we should work jointly with our like-minded partners on sustainable infrastructure projects, being it physical or digital, especially in low and medium income countries of the region. We should seek to promote our economic interest by attempting to conclude new trade and investment agreements, notably with Australia, New Zealand, and Indonesia, and by further diversifying our supply chains in Europe. Despite China's economic omnipresence in the region, our approach as the European Union needs to be more strategic and focused on sustainable investments and reinforcement of the EU's role as a global norm setter. Setting rules, norms, and standards such as in environment, energy, advanced manufacturing, or digital technology will give Europe competitive advantage and benefit our investments in the region. A final remark. The EU's economic interest is definitely intertwined with the security and stability of the region. With 50% of the EU's total maritime trade transiting the Indian Ocean, we should play our part in response to mounting security challenges in the Indo-Pacific, ranging from maritime security to non-proliferation, cybersecurity, and counterterrorism. We should be aware in Europe that enhancing our footprint and capabilities to act in the region is critical to the long-term survival of a rules-based international order. So without prioritizing the freedom of navigation, open sea lines, and full compliance with international law, the EU's interest and the interests of our partners like Australia in the region will suffer. To conclude, preserving peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific remains critically, especially in the absence of overarching regional security frameworks. Therefore, closer security and defense cooperation with Asian and Pacific allies should become an integral part of the EU's action in the region. Here we can build on our extensive work with our partners such as India, Indonesia, Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and Vietnam, especially on maritime and cybersecurity, counterterrorism, and countering violent extremism or training in peacekeeping. I believe that the EU's new approach towards the Indo-Pacific is a promising step in the right direction. It definitely signals our ambition to play an active role in this region by harnessing different policies and connecting better with the like-minded partners. I do hope that this will open new dimensions for beneficial cooperation between the EU and the Indo-Pacific, but now it will be important to put flesh on the bones of this strategy and work with our partners in the region to promote our common values and interests. And Australia, as I have pointed out, will remain one of our most important partners in the region. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. David McAllister, Chairman of the Committee on Foreign Affairs of the European Parliament. We appreciate you making the time to join us early in the morning there, and your remarks really helped frame our discussion today. I'm now honored to introduce our next introductory speaker, the German ambassador to Australia, Dr. Thomas Fitzgen. Sorry, I didn't get that quite right. I had hoped to have practice because the ambassador was out here in Western Australia just this past week for the historic visit of the frigate, the Bowen. But unfortunately, I am in hotel quarantine, so I was unable to join you. But without further ado, let me please turn the time over to Dr. Thomas Fitzgen.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope everyone can hear me. Yes, okay. Well, first of all, let me thank the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation and, of course, the Perth USAsia Centre for inviting me, for adding me to this presentation of your study on Europe's Indo-Pacific embrace, and to say a few words on the IP deployment of the German frigate. The ship is on its way to Darwin right now, and then on to Guam, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, Singapore, and other places in the next few months. And I just came back from Fremantle actually yesterday. I was allowed, I did have to undergo hotel quarantine, but I was allowed to leave the hotel for exactly 4 moments. So I was present on the ship. I had that privilege. And also I found on my return a fresh printed copy of your study. I think it's hard to read 54 pages on the computer. So I would like to thank the Center and the Adenauer Foundation and all contributors to what looks like a very fascinating read. Maybe a few words on why the Indo-Pacific deployment 21, why now? It is our perception, as of course the first speaker has already indicated, that the Indo-Pacific is where the international order of the future will be decided. The Bowen has gone on a 7-month patrol and training mission to contribute to emphasizing and upholding rules-based international order, including at sea, to improve coordination with our partners. And all of that is also a step forward in implementing the German foreign policy, Indo-Pacific guidelines. And I would still have to insist that we call it Indo-Pacific guidelines, not an Indo-Pacific strategy. And that is being done on purpose, as of course, may be discussed in the coming couple of hours. Germany has adopted and worked on this Indo-Pacific guidelines because we do have a genuine interest in peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific and in the upkeep of the international rules-based order. Free and secure maritime trade routes are important. 2/3 of our international sea trade, as was already mentioned, come via the Indo-Pacific. 20% of German trade is in this region, and some of the most important trade partners, and you have to mention China, Japan, and Korea, are in this area. So, in short, I think a lot of the future prosperity and well-being of Germany, of Europe, and basically of everyone else in the Indo-Pacific depends on stability, peace, and development in that area. That's why the Indo-Pacific guidelines and also the EU strategy that has just been adopted offer as we see it, coherent and inclusive policy framework. Germany offers itself as a partner to all countries in this region on a vast array of issues, not just what I've mentioned before, but also on trade, on cooperation on environmental issues, cooperation on climate research, cooperation on the development of technologies, human rights and the rule of law, on connectivity, on digital transformation, and of course on security policy. By outlining this long list of topics, we are of course not naive. We all note increasing tensions and the risk of conflict in this region. We are not ignoring or evading existing differences. We are quite aware of what is going on, of course. Our approach, as laid out in the Indo-Pacific guidelines and now in the EU strategy, is all the more important in this context. I think it's inclusive, it's a rules-based approach. It calls for consultations to avoid confrontation, and maybe one of the most practical proposals these days would be that we do all we can to minimize also the risk of unintended escalation of conflict by mistake or conflict by misunderstanding. That's what our ship is doing. It has come here and it is communicating clearly what it intends to do. The whole Indo-Pacific deployment was no small effort on the part of the German Defense Forces. I don't know whether you are aware that the German Navy has no more than 11 ships of the size and capabilities of the Bayern right now. All of them, of course, tied up and committed to various NATO and EU operations. So freeing one ship with a crew of 200 sailors and soldiers for 7 months and sending it off literally to the other end of the world, where we have, unlike our French friends, no territory, no port or posts of our own, was a very heavy undertaking for the German Defense Forces. Exchanging personnel along the route, doing long-range remote maintenance and provisioning is quite a huge effort. And for the crew itself, it's not a pleasure trip. It's a training and exercise mission, which includes maneuvers and cooperation with various partners along the route. It included participation in the EU Atalanta mission on anti-piracy, and it will include an element on monitoring UN sanctions regime against North Korea. That is all top-notch professional work. And in times of COVID, not even the port visits are easy anymore. With different entry and sometimes very strict and strenuous testing regimes for the crew before they can step down on land, if they can at all, or invite VIPs and visitors on board, as I've just experienced myself, is very difficult. Sending this one ship around the Indo-Pacific for 7 months was never intended to be a projection of military might into waters so far away from Europe. The purpose of the mission was and continues to be showing our partners and everyone else in the region that we are ready to shoulder this burden, signaling that we take maritime security and upholding international law on the sea seriously, proving that our ships and crews have the capacity and the capability to team up with forces of our allies and partners, to operate with them and to really underpin the strategic partnerships that we have in this region. Australian friends, I think, have understood that completely, as the reactions from Defence Minister Dutton, my colleagues at DFAT, and the many conversations with colleagues I have had over the past week in Fremantle have clearly shown. And of course, it has to be seen against the background of the newly minted strategic partnership, or the enhanced strategic partnership. We did have a strategic partnership already for years, but this now has been enhanced and uplifted last June, following 2+2 consultations of foreign and defense ministers, and endorsed by our Chancellor and Prime Minister Morrison in the margins of the G7 summit. And during those 2+2 talks, Australian Ministers Payne and Dutton expressly welcomed the Bayern's deployment and underlined the importance of having this German ship in the Indo-Pacific. So that's basically what I wanted to report back from the visit of our ship, simply to add some points and views to your discussion. And now I look forward, of course, to the presentation of the remaining studies and to the maybe discussion at the end of it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you again, Ambassador Fitzton, and my apologies for mispronouncing your name early on. But in response, feel free to correctly pronounce my name, which is Flake, which I wish more people would mispronounce it more often. It doesn't work out. Look, your very detailed description of the scale and scope of the mission of the Bayern makes me doubly sorry that I missed the opportunity to visit when it was here in Fremantle. But one person who did is my colleague, James Bowen. James is a policy fellow here at the Perth USAsia Centre and has took the lead in this project, working together closely with his colleagues at the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung to produce this edited volume on Europe's Indo-Pacific embrace. 10 wonderful chapters. I wish we could have brought in all 10 authors in to give you a sense of the diversity of the perspectives that really reflect how important these issues are to Europe. But we are fortunate to have 3 wonderful chapter authors with us today. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the time over to my colleague, James Bowen, who is the editor of the volume, to have him moderate a discussion among some of the chapter authors. So James, over to you.
Thanks, Gordon. And thanks also to Mr. McAllister and Ambassador Fitzton for their very important and supportive remarks. First, as an editor, I need to acknowledge the authors who contributed to their exceptional insight. and made my job as editor of this publication with Konrad-Adenauer so rewarding. So that's Frederick Gra, Celine Pahon, Barbara Ferkel, Micah O'Connor-Hymans, Veerle Nouwens, who's here today with us, Ryosuke Tanaka, Rory Medcalf, who's also here with us today, Darshana Baruha, Lynn Kuok, who's here with us today, and I'm Josephine Terrell. So as Gordon mentioned, I was fortunate enough a few days ago to witness European and Indo-Pacific interests and abilities come together firsthand when I represented the Perth USAsia Centre on a reception on board the Bowen, which was docked at the port of Fremantle as part of its very long and busy journey around the region. Now, the scene of representatives of German and Australian defence, government, business, civil society coming together as the sun set over the Indian Ocean to discuss mutual interests and abilities was certainly apt in the context of this project. Now, I was particularly struck by the symbolism of Ambassador Fitchin, who gave his acknowledgement of the traditional owners of the area in the local Noongar language. I think that was really captured the spirit of mutual understanding that will be necessary to make Europe's embrace of the Indo-Pacific a success. Now, I might be a little bit pointed here in saying that recent events, and I think you probably know that I'm referring to the AUKUS arrangement and some of the diplomatic fallout from that, have revealed that there's a fair way to go on this understanding front. But I stress that's a geographically neutral statement. Fundamentally, there's a need for all interests, whether European or Indo-Pacific, to speak more openly and honestly about what they want to contribute and also what they want to take, frankly, from the region if we want to see meaningful and workable partnerships continue to flourish. So, as Gordon mentioned, we're fortunate to have 3 people here who can help advance that process of honest stock taking. I'm sure most of the audience would be familiar with Lynn Kuok, who is Senior Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in Singapore, Veerle Nouwens, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Royal Institute for Defence and Security Studies in London, and Rory Medcalf, who is Head of the National Security College at the Australian National University. The 3 speakers are each going to give a quick impulse statement, well, of a few minutes, drawing on their contribution to the volume and their thoughts on the issues at hand, some of the things we've been speaking about today already. And then we'll follow up with what I hope will be a lively panel conversation. So first up is Lynn, who wrote the chapter on Southeast Asia and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Lynn, thanks for joining us, quite appropriately from Europe today, in Berlin to be precise. So we'd love to hear your opening thoughts.
Thanks so much, James. And also thank you so much for your work as well on my chapter. My thanks also to Professor Gordon Flake of the Perth USAsia Centre and the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung for the invitation to contribute a chapter on ASEAN's response to Europe's engagement in the Indo-Pacific and to offer some thoughts on this. I think the starting point to notice that there is no official ASEAN position on the involvement of European powers in the Indo-Pacific. The ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which was issued in June 2019, is silent on this matter. It's fair, I think, to say, however, that Southeast Asia has broadly welcomed increased European interest in the region, even though visions for the region might not be perfectly aligned, including on issues of human rights and possibly China as well. Southeast Asia considers the presence of European powers to be potentially helpful in maintaining the balance of power, in taking the edge of US-China rivalry, and expanding the region's narrowing strategic options in the face of US-China competition and concerns over the long-term US commitment in the region and wherewithal in the region. In an Institute of Southeast Asian Studies poll that was conducted amongst elites earlier this year supports this view that Southeast Asia welcomes European powers. It found in that survey that the EU, and by the EU, this report means EU countries, and Japan are the clear frontrunners for broadening ASEAN strategic options in its attempts to hedge in the face of US-China rivalry at roughly 40% each. The poll also found that the EU remains the second most trusted partner in the region after Japan. So the EU scored 51% and Japan 67.1%, so both doing fairly well. Southeast Asia did not in the past generally regard Europe as a serious strategic play in the region, but this is changing somewhat. I think various actions have boosted European credibility in the region. We've seen British, French, and German assertions of maritime rights and freedoms in the South China Sea. We've seen the Bowen, of course, sail across the Indo-Pacific. This has been welcome. We've had the rolling out of various European Indo-Pacific policy documents, whether it's a strategy or a guideline. But this, all took place either last year or in the case of the UK Indo-Pacific tilt earlier this year. And we've had the British deployment of the Carrier Strike Group, led by the UK's largest and most powerful surface vessel ever, the HMS Queen Elizabeth. And of course, the recent AUKUS deal, which has signaled the longevity of British commitment to the region. I think it's important to note that European powers are not only upping their individual games in the Indo-Pacific, they're also working closely with allies and partners in the security realm. And the British Carrier Strike Group includes a Dutch frigate, a US destroyer, as well as 10 US aircraft. The AUKUS deal has, I would say, hurt, I don't know whether that's understating it, but it's hurt transatlantic ties somewhat, as well as the ability of the UK and France to work together in the short term. But in my view, France has enduring interest in the Indo-Pacific, which it has outlined in its Indo-Pacific strategy. And these interests are best served working in partnership with the powers it now understandably spurns. I would thus not be too pessimistic about the medium to longer term prospects for cooperation in the region. Now, Europe's increased economic engagement with Southeast Asia and the broader region has also helped to boost its credibility amongst Southeast Asian countries. And I think, a successful conclusion of an EU-ASEAN trade deal would also would also increase its credibility. But it's also important to remember that Southeast Asian attitudes have been influenced as much by increased European engagement as by a growing sense of urgency provoked by deteriorating security conditions. While Southeast Asian policy elites often say that they do not want to choose between the US and China amid intensifying great power rivalry, I think this formulation actually obscures parallel fears over unlawful and coercive Chinese actions, not least in the South China Sea, where China has militarized features and encroached upon the exclusive economic zones of littoral states. I think the framing of not wanting to choose also sidesteps Southeast Asian concerns over long-term US goals in the region and whether these will put the great powers on a collision course. Now, given Southeast Asia's broad welcome of European engagement, there are multiple potentially fruitful areas for cooperation. The ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific highlights areas in which ASEAN seeks cooperation. First, the maritime arena. Second, supporting ASEAN connectivity. Third, meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the economy, strengthening the economy. So since the ASEAN Outlook was issued, the coronavirus pandemic has also given rise to increased demand for investments in health infrastructures. I think many of these needs or interests dovetail clearly with initiatives in the French, German, Dutch, and British Indo-Pacific policy documents. The differing interests and relative strengths of each of these European countries will, of course, influence their individual approaches to the region. France and the UK have adopted a more forward-leaning security role, while German and Dutch security presence will be complementary to that of the French and the British. I've spoken to various senior officials in Germany, and I understand that we are unlikely to see another frigate head to the region in the next 2 or 3 years. Nonetheless, I think Germany and the EU are important economic players and could better leverage their economic growth for geopolitical ends, including in seeking to reach an ASEAN-EU free trade agreement as soon as possible. Now, while European powers might each place different emphasis on security versus economic engagement, neither is sustainable without the other. A security-heavy approach would deny Europe important tools to shape the region, while serious Indo-Pacific security challenges render an economics-only approach unsustainable. So really, I think the region needs both, and it's in the interests of European powers both to offer economic as well as more hard power engagement. But I think perhaps one of the lowest cost, high impact things that Europe could do is to act as a moderating force in US-China relations, steering the US away from a counterproductive anti-China bloc. I think the Indo-Pacific guidelines issued by the various European nations all appear to varying degrees sensitive to this concern. I also think that in this vein, European governments should seek to tone down any framing of the geopolitical competition as one between democracies and authoritarian states, as this unnecessarily deepens divisions, alienates potential partners in Southeast Asia at least, and opens up strategic space to China. But it's also important, however, that a moderating influence must not mean failing to take a strong stance to defend and promote a rules-based order, including international law. And Europe and Southeast Asia together must actively counter actions that undermine this. So to briefly conclude, Southeast Asia welcomes greater European engagement in the Indo-Pacific, where there are multiple avenues for fruitful cooperation on both multilateral as well as bilateral bases. Such cooperation will not be free from challenges, given varying approaches to human rights, governance, and possibly China. By and large, however, Southeast Asia and Europe share interest in defending a rules-based order and promoting peace and stability in the region, and there's considerable scope there for working together to promote these ends. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Lynn. I really like that point that you make about trust and also about the European interests in the chapter. And today, European interests needing to be sensitive to ASEAN concerns and processes. And I want to return to that idea of moderating US-China rivalry or dynamics later on. But for the time being, I'm going to move on to Rory Medcalf, who's going to give his introductory statement on his perspective on Australia in particular and European Indo-Pacific convergence more broadly.
Thanks very much, James, for that, and thanks everyone for involving me in this. I think it's a great initiative and incredibly well timed. I'll try and pick up on a few of the remarks we've just heard, because I think there are a few themes there that will resonate throughout this discussion on, I guess, the opportunities and the challenges for Europe, for the EU and European member states individually in the Indo-Pacific. The first point I'd make, and I will come back later to the submarine elephant in the room. I'll come back to that at the end of my remarks. I'm sure that will come up in the discussion. But the first point I'll make is both personally as an Australian analyst, but also I'm sure from an Australian national interest perspective, there's overwhelmingly a positive welcome to the EU being much more explicit about its interests and its engagement in the Indo-Pacific. The guidelines, the strategy, however we're going to frame it, I think this is highly welcome. And tangible indications of that, such as the German frigate visit, again, are very welcome. I'd say that at one level this is, look, at one level it's almost a pleasant surprise, because many of us, as I argue in my chapter, have been watching European engagement in this region for many years. And if you wound back the clock 5, 10, 15 years, it was, for a time there, I think much less multidimensional, much more focused on commercial opportunity overwhelmingly, or focused on the assumption that this region was going to be stable, all about mutual prosperity and all about the gradual erosion of differences between nations. And that obviously hasn't been the case. So I think in the last 3 or 4 years, Europe's been on quite an accelerated path to recognise the new realities of the Indo-Pacific and engage with those. And I think that's highly welcome in Australia. That does converge to a significant degree with Australia's own directions regarding the trajectory of the Indo-Pacific. If you go back to 2013, of course, as I point out in my chapter and in my book on the Indo-Pacific, Australia was the first country to really identify the Indo-Pacific as our region of strategic interest and to recognise those trends both of economic connectivity and strategic contest that were going to frame the region. Now, back then, a mere 8 years ago. I don't think any of us quite anticipated how intense the strategic rivalry dimension would become, or how really assertive and confrontational a lot of Chinese behaviour in the region would become so quickly. And that's, I think, forced on Australia in recent years a choice of the kind of Indo-Pacific strategic settings we're going to aim for. And so I think the risk here, and a risk that I'll come to at the end of my remarks, is that the EU approach was perfect for the Indo-Pacific of 2 or 3 years ago, but the region is moving so quickly that this is going to have to continue to adapt, just as the Australian approach is going to continue to adapt. And there I'll be, if you like, slightly critical of well, not so much the Australian approach, but of the way that Australia is projecting its position on the Indo-Pacific at the moment. That is, in my view, we have a very clear two-track strategy. Diplomatically, Australia is doing, or has been doing, many of the things that the EU approach promises. That is, an inclusive engagement with the region, a focus on diplomacy, a focus on trying to maintain and uphold rules and norms with the widest possible coalition of partners in the region. But at a strategic level, there is intensifying rivalry. There is an intensifying determination to, frankly, to balance Chinese power and to deter untoward actions, particularly by China in the regional order. Now, there's an obvious tension between that two-prong approach by Australia and the, the submarine situation, crisis, whatever we're going to call it, in recent weeks, I think is the most tangible manifestation of that tension, but it won't be the last manifestation of that tension. And it's actually a tension that I think we're all going to feel, ASEAN, Europe and others, in the years ahead. So I put that up there as kind of a ghost at the banquet, if you like, to say that this is just the beginning. And I think that the principles behind the EU approach to the Indo-Pacific are fantastic. They're welcome, but the challenge now is going to be to strike that balance that I think some of our speakers have already alluded to. That is, to be inclusive without appeasing, to promote and adopt a rules and norms-based approach with a wide range of partners, but to make firm choices when rules are broken. So I kind of warn that's the beginning of the conversation, but I don't think Europe has a choice, because I do think that both the EU collectively and member states individually are recognising that Europe has genuine interests at stake here, and that to achieve a stable global future where, as I would argue, Chinese power is not contained and not accommodated, but essentially incorporated into a regional system of equal sovereign states, Europe's not going to be able to protect its interests and values if it's not engaged in the Indo-Pacific. So look, to conclude, I'd just make 2 points. One about the layers or the prongs of what I think a realistic European approach in the region can and should be, which I illuminate in my chapter. And secondly, just a few comments on whether AUKUS changes things or not. Again, I think the Indo-Pacific is it's a global region. That's no contradiction. It's the region that is most globally significant in terms of economic growth, in terms of strategic tension, in terms of demographics, in terms of impacts of climate in many ways, and indeed even in terms of technology rivalry. So all of those areas converge on this region is important. And because of that, although it's welcome to see European naval activity, European naval presence, exercises, engagement and so forth, it's not enough. And in many ways, it won't necessarily be the most important issue. I think it's one dimension of a multidimensional engagement. And that's why it's good to see the reference to investment, to infrastructure, to standards, to capacity building, to all of those dimensions of engagement, because in my view, that's where Europe will have the most consequential impact on managing the balance in the Indo-Pacific, and indeed contributing to the ability of small and middle powers across the region to protect and advance their own interests, to make their own choices about dubious investment and infrastructure proposals, to build their own accountability and transparency domestically. And I guess the challenge there, as it's always been for Europe and the region, is to do this in ways that are consonant with, if you like, the cultures, the systems of Indo-Pacific countries. And I think all democracies have lessons to help one another with there. So again, I'd say maritime presence good, but in many ways, I think a lot of the real action is going to be elsewhere. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about AUKUS and the the drama of the past few weeks. Does it fundamentally change the expectations that Europe should place on itself in the Indo-Pacific, or the expectations a country like Australia should reasonably have? I actually don't think that it does. I mean, I think it has sharpened the contours probably more rapidly than many of us would have liked about the tensions and the contradictions in engaging with the region. I think it has reinforced how real the strategic stakes are for a country like Australia, and how, in fact, unfortunately, Australia, and in this case the United States and Britain as well, were willing to incur and inflict diplomatic pain, and more than that, in order to, in their view, safeguard long-term strategic interests. I think there are going to be, I hope, more honest conversations about those issues as a consequence, as well as obvious challenges in building or rebuilding trust, and I fully understand and accept that. So I'm going to pause there, and I hope what I've said is mildly provocative but useful nonetheless. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. That was really insightful, and you've obviously played a key role in bringing Australians and others in the region around to the concept of the Indo-Pacific. So it's quite valuable to hear your thoughts on how the congregation can be expanded, so to speak, with European involvement. And you're quite right, we will speak a bit more about AUKUS in a second. So I'll allow Lynn to respond to some of those comments as well. And Veerle, who's up next? You can perhaps hold your thoughts for the broader discussion as well, if you wish, or make some comments initially. So returning to Europe, I want to introduce Veerle Nouwens, who wrote the chapter on the UK, but she's also functioning as a bit of a pan-Europeanist in today's proceedings. So we'd love to hear some of your thoughts on the UK and broader European engagement with the Indo-Pacific.
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you to Cass and also the Perth USA Centre for this opportunity and for allowing me to contribute into what is such a fantastic publication. I'm just going to speak very briefly because I know that we want to get to the Q&A session as fast as possible. But I'm going to just offer a few thoughts on the UK tilts to the Indo-Pacific. Firstly, I just want to mention that this is, I think, a mistake to view it as simply a result of Brexit. UK interest in the region has been growing since 2010, 2015, 16. Over the years, the economic importance of the region has been well signaled in successive UK strategic reviews. And of course, this is now culminated in the integrated review and the Defence Command Paper, which were released shortly one after another earlier this year, in which the UK outlined a move from what was previously a all of Asia policy to one which is now an Indo-Pacific tilt. And I think the tilt there is very important to recognize as well, given that it is not a full pivot, but it is a greater inclusion towards a strategy and a strategic approach towards this new combined region. In terms of the Indo-Pacific, obviously prosperity is hugely important to the UK directly and indirectly. The UK is affected by the enormous growth that stands to emerge in this region. But the geoeconomic rise and the importance of the Indo-Pacific in that sense is really predicated and premised on the stability and security in the region as well. And that is very clear to the UK. So as a result, the UK integrated review and also the Defence Command paper speak of a host of challenges, from maritime security and stability at sea to global power projection in the region and geostrategic shifts, as well as other issues of transnational organized crime, terrorism, nuclear proliferation, and so on and so forth. But one defining issue, and that I think is present in all European guidelines, strategies, frameworks, is the rise of China and the assertiveness that we've seen on the part of China in transgressions and incursions into various countries' territories, and also the flagrant abandon of international law in its own region, particularly pertaining to UNCLOS. And that really has a global impact in the view of the UK. So, talking about rule of law, more generally talking about impacting standards, setting new norms as well, that stands to directly impact the UK's national security, and that is recognized. And so in the integrated review, you see a recognition that China is, and the assertiveness of China is the most significant geopolitical factor in the 2020s, in the coming decade, and that China is deemed a both systemic competitor as well as challenge for UK national security, prosperity, and values. So, building on that, there's a recognition that the Indo-Pacific state of security at the moment is not one which is just neatly defined in a binary category of a state of war and state of peace, but rather a constant state of blurred competition that is manifested through economic statecraft, through cybersecurity issues, through disinformation, and of course through hybrid action at sea and in other domains. So the question is, what does the UK do about this? Now, the UK has signaled that it wants to pursue a balanced approach to China, and I think that is something that we see in the other European strategies as well. And of course, there are plenty of questions around how that can be done. It's all nice and well to say that you want to cooperate where you can, but compete where you must. But that is easier said than done sometimes, and I think everyone is trying to find their way forward, including the UK in that respect. It wants to help not only support and maintain the rules-based international order, but also help shape the rules-based international order. And I think this is something different. This is something quite unique to the UK's strategy, in that they see new and emerging areas where the international rules-based order is insufficient or not yet developed. And in that respect, the UK wants to take a leadership position in helping shape that together with Indo-Pacific partners. It also wants to promote free trade, of course, and finally support open societies. So it doesn't necessarily speak about democracies versus non-democracies, although authoritarian regimes are, problematic, but it speaks about open societies. It also wants to be a convening power, and we see that already through the G7 Plus initiatives. We've seen that through, speaking around the E3 and releasing statements with the E3. That is certainly something that the UK wants to continue to pursue, because it believes in the role of middle powers in this new geostrategic landscape. And it wants to also engage with existing multilateral structures, and we see that with the successful accession to Asean as a dialogue partner. There's also a focus on non-traditional security areas. I know we focus a lot about ships at sea and planes in the air, but actually looking at these new areas of security, cyber, AI, quantum, science and technology more generally, and the standards that come with those are of, I think, central focus in the integrated review, and that can be seen. But that does not mean that the UK is not interested in a more permanent or at least consistent defense presence in the region. And we see that, of course, with the Carrier Strike Group at the moment, but also the signal that the UK will send to OPVs for the next 5 years, permanently position them in the Indo-Pacific, followed by a littoral strike group, and then by 2030 a destroyer. And of course, it will also build its defense networks in the region and increase investment and step that up in the Five Powers Defense Arrangement. So a really multi-pronged approach on the part of the UK, one that is humble for now, but has a very grand ambition towards the end of the decade, and ultimately to be seen as the leading European power and engager in the Indo-Pacific, which is no small feat. There are, of course, challenges in this, as we see currently in the UK, the economic impact of Brexit and, of course, COVID more generally have hurt the UK economy, does create some problems, and the question is how that impacts budgets, of course. There is also an issue of political will and geostrategic security and imperatives. The fact that Russia is outlined as the top national security for the UK means that the UK will have to balance its interests in the Euro-Atlantic area with those in the Indo-Pacific. And then the fact that the domestic audience here and the wider general public does not yet really understand the Indo-Pacific and does not really understand necessarily the UK's tilt towards the region. So that needs to be reinforced and built upon. And then finally, in pure defense asset terms, the UK is stretched. It is limited in what it can do. And so we will see a dip in frigate numbers over the coming years. But I would argue that with all these challenges, the UK so far has been off to a promising start. One of the criticisms is how do you balance your values with your interests? And it is, I think, noteworthy that the UK has become a dialogue partner of ASEAN despite the tensions with Myanmar and the sanctions that have been placed there. It has so far been able to manage and maintain its relationship with China, even after applying sanctions and being more vocal on the situation in the South China Sea, and indeed recently also passing through the Taiwan Straits. We'll see if that can be maintained, but so far I think it has done well in doing so. And then, of course, also just more generally in terms of signaling its long-term commitment to the region, that this is not just a one-off, I think is encouraging to the countries in the region, but it will require consistent communication and signaling as to what its actual engagement on the ground will be and how that will evolve. And then finally, partnerships for the UK are incredibly important. The US, the countries of the Quad more generally, and other middle powers, but I would say Europe as well. And here I think, we do see a test ahead of us, I think, in terms of how the UK and Europe can cooperate in the Indo-Pacific, as I think they should, given the overlapping interests between the UK and Europe and the EU indeed as well. Despite the tensions of AUKUS, and we can get into that later, it would be, I think, to our own, it would be a shame on our own part and also the countries in the region if this were to become an issue that prevents cooperation looking forward. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Veerle. That was really comprehensive, and I love the way that you ended on that note of partnerships, because that's actually kind of the first question that I would love to turn over to the panel. So I'd be interested to know, we've spoken about some of the key issues, but I want to know about the key partnerships that each of you sees as advancing cooperation on those issues that we've spoken about. So we've already kind of explored some of those in the book, and I'd love to hear some elaboration. So perhaps Lynn, you might like to start on Southeast Asia. So do you see it inevitably as an ASEAN EU partnership, or are there individual nation to nation or perhaps nation to bloc relationships that might be more important than that bloc to bloc relationship for the region?
Thanks, James. I think they are both important. So both the bilateral relationships as well as the multilateral relationships. I think one criticism of the US approach to the Indo-Pacific is that it has focused very much on its bilateral relationships, which are important. So Singapore, Vietnam in particular were singled out in its interim strategy for the Indo-Pacific. But the criticism has been that it has neglected it was neglecting its engagement with ASEAN, whereas China, for instance, has been quite diligent about engaging the region both bilaterally and multilaterally. So I think the first point I would make is that while the EU or Europe should be pursuing bilateral relationships with countries where they see compatible needs and interests, they should also work very hard to engage the region multilaterally. In terms of which countries would benefit from stronger ties. I think we've seen European countries already reaching out to Vietnam in terms of supporting its maritime domain awareness, the Philippines as well. And I think there is benefit to be gained in terms of working on capacity building, in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, of course, but also economically. I think many of the countries in Southeast Asia are reeling from the effects of COVID, and of course, Germany being an economics power, the EU as well should be working quite closely with them in terms of economic recovery post COVID, digital agreements as well. I think Singapore and the United States, but also Europe, could work on digital trade agreements, which could in turn then be a pathfinder for a broader digital agreement between Europe, perhaps the United States, and as well as Southeast Asia.
Thanks, Lynn. That's great. Rory, so turning to you, perhaps the answer to this question, what were the key relationships for Australia might have been somewhat different in the region, but maybe not. So I think, would you give your perspective on who you see as the key partners to Australia and the issues that we might be able to work on in that space?
Well, look, the way I'd put it actually is to put the European engagement and the engagement with the Indo-Pacific in the context of how Australia sees the priority relationships, because there are some relationships that Australia is going to focus very heavily on that may not necessarily be the priorities for European partners. I think the challenge here is to develop a kind of a coordination and a division of labour particularly among democracies that want a rules-based order in the region, and that all have something to contribute. And I think in many ways the EU's long, hard experience of coordination internally can be potentially very useful in engaging with the rest of us. I mean, I think it's absolutely right that the EU place priority on engaging with ASEAN collectively, because apart from anything else, it's going to impose on ASEAN a very different kind of institutional scrutiny to the kind of institutional scrutiny that ASEAN imposes on itself. I mean, there'll be a lot of, I think, serious policymakers in the EU who'll take a look at something like the Code of Conduct that China and ASEAN have been drafting on the South China Sea for a long time now, and wonder actually how useful is that going to be. So I think there could be some pretty honest, fruitful engagements between the EU and ASEAN. It'll need to be done in a respectful way, but that data we've heard about the levels of respect among ASEAN elites for the European Union as an institution can be leveraged, I think, quite effectively if Europe is smart about that diplomacy. The other partnerships and relationships I'd put priority on is certainly how do we coordinate Europe and the Quad? And I think that, if the last few weeks tell us anything about the prioritisation in Australia's relationships in the region, I think for full spectrum engagement with regional challenges, the Quad is really high on the list for Australia now. I think AUKUS is actually a more niche and specialised arrangement. It really is primarily about technology sharing rather than about a military alliance. But the Quad really matters, and the way in which Europe collectively or individual states, particularly France and Germany, engage now with the Quad or with Quad countries is going to be, I think, an absolute priority. I'd leave it there.
Thanks, Rory, and I'll turn to the Quad and some of the changes in the security and other infrastructure of the region in a second. So, Veerle, have you got any input on that side of things in terms of, you mentioned the importance of I guess we call it the so-called special relationship with the US for London, and also you did mention the members of the Quad. Can you give some insight onto where you see that progressing?
Sure. I mean, I think for the UK, obviously the top partner is the US in the region, but so too are Japan and Australia. Those relationships, as we've seen, are growing at pace. We see new discussions with Japan as well around basing agreements, and with AUKUS, of course, with Australia. That has been a signal of I think what's to come. I think that the outlier a little bit is India, in that there have been some problems in the bilateral relationship. There are some struggles that are sought to, at the moment, be smoothed over through a new roadmap for UK-India relations, which Boris Johnson released earlier this year. So that is off to a promising start, but we'll see how that develops. But I think also, I agree with Lynn in that there needs to also be an engagement with existing architecture and with other frameworks. So bilateral and also multilateral engagements. Here, I think you will see the UK double up in, as I mentioned, existing regional architecture, as well as those E3 frameworks and other multilateral groupings. But I would argue that the Netherlands should probably be included in this when it comes to European engagement and coordination with the UK. I think we've seen over the past year and years closer relationships with the UK and the Netherlands, and that I think can be built upon. I mean, the Netherlands was also the first country to release a China statement or a China strategy in Europe. And also, obviously, I think there's quite a lot of overlap with the Indo-Pacific guidelines that they released. So that, I think, is a partnership that we don't speak enough about. But just, in terms of other countries in the region, and in addition to the middle powers that we've mentioned already, I would like to also draw attention to some of the Eastern African countries, where I think, Europe and the UK stand to contribute a lot to the Indian Ocean region. And I think there is an immense amount of opportunity for coordination there specifically, but that would also include an African coastal element to that. And there isn't nearly enough engagement with Africa on the Indo-Pacific. So here, the UK's Commonwealth network, its existing assets, for example, in Kenya, but also Oman, its relationship with South Africa. These are all, ties to the region that I think can help pull in the continent to create a more coordinated Indian Ocean approach. So that is, I think, my 2 cents on the partnerships that are currently in existence, but also need to be reinforced.
James, can I just add one point?
Yeah.
It was an excellent point about Africa there. I completely agree. And interestingly, one of the, I think Africa is still a blind spot in Australia's own Indo-Pacific strategy. There's this strange notion that, the Indian Ocean just sort of disappears off the edge of the map somewhere and there's nothing on the other side. I think that Africa is a big part of what is dragging China into the Indian Ocean and what is actually drawing great power rivalry into the Indian Ocean. We need a diversity of countries building capacity in Africa, so I completely would support that.
Excellent point. And I think both of you, Rory and Veerle, have spoken a fair bit about the Quad and AUKUS so far. So I might turn over to Lynn on your views on how you see this change in the regional strategic architecture, recent changes, how that influences European engagement with ASEAN and Southeast Asia or the broader region. Does it at all?
Thanks, James. I think first let's address first how recent developments have affected Southeast Asia, and then after that, let's look at whether or not it's affected European engagement with Southeast Asia. So if we look at the recent developments, the momentum that the quadrilateral security dialogue has developed under the Biden administration, first under the Trump administration and then under the Biden administration, and we look at the recent signing of the AUKUS deal, what's clear is that we're seeing political security minilaterals that are bypassing an ASEAN-centered regional architecture. And I think so. You'll have on the one hand minilaterals that are, US-led with its Western partners, and then you'll have China with its Belt and Road Initiative and its web of economic ties with countries in Southeast Asia. So you have a US-led and China-led bloc. The first doesn't really, it pays lip service to ASEAN, and the second you see greater engagement with ASEAN. So you have 2 blocks, one referencing ASEAN a lot more, engaging ASEAN a lot more. So I think you have that sort of dichotomy as a result of AUKUS and Quad. And so I think that Western the US and its Western allies and partners need to be very conscious that they don't neglect the Quad and AUKUS completely. I think they're not mutually exclusive. Engagement with ASEAN as well as engagement with the Quad and AUKUS. They're not mutually exclusive, but I think countries in the region are concerned that, given scarce time and resources, that most of the resources will be focused on AUKUS and the Quad. So that's one thing. In terms of European engagement and how that's how that's affected by the Quad and AUKUS, I think that actually opens up a space. If we're talking about, let's have division of labor loosely referenced, if that opens up a space for Europe to engage more with ASEAN as well, because I think the European powers as well as ASEAN do share a sort of vision for the region, which might be a little bit more moderate than a US-led one or a Chinese-led one that's more inclusive, one that's focused more on promotion of the rules-based order as opposed to, strategic primacy by a particular power. So I think that it does open up a space for Europe, and also it probably makes engagement with Europe more urgent for Southeast Asia.
Okay, thank you. Do Rory or Veerle, do you have anything to add to that front?
Oh, look, I would agree with broadly with what Lynn said. I would note that I think that's a desirable situation, but I do think that the pressures, particularly that we're seeing coming from China, and I think the expectations of the Biden administration now are going to make that harder and harder. And so I think there'll need to be also a set of policies which identify those areas where a third way can be pursued, and those areas where at some point choices are going to have to be made. And I just feel that this is a dynamic that's happening quite quickly in Australia, and I wouldn't be surprised if within the next 6 to 12 months a number of other countries have to contend with it as well.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think we're probably around approaching our final question. I wanted to draw on one of the most commonly isolated challenges to future European engagement in the Indo-Pacific, and that was a lack of EU member state cohesion, particularly on the allocation of military resources. Now, I personally don't see there being any great answer to that anytime in the future, so perhaps it's a matter of adaptation, and indeed, Frederick Grau in his chapter spoke of Indo-Pacific countries needing to become comfortable with the idiosyncrasies of the EU, becoming familiar with them and dealing in that sense. But I want to know what that means in practice. So maybe, Rory, you can perhaps offer some thoughts on that to start with.
I'm not sure I'm the best place to offer a view on that, and I'm going to try and throw that to our colleagues, and I'm going to throw that to Veerle. But before I do, I would also just note that, because time is short, that a fundamental challenge I see ahead now is as Australia seeks to find a footing for its relationship with France in the Indo-Pacific, because I think that there's no question that France has interests, is engaged, has a lot to offer, and there's still, I think, a broad desire to build a cooperative relationship, that the role of other European powers and of the EU institutionally is going to be really important in building those understandings. So I can't sort of bow out without throwing that into the mix. But I think on cohesion of European military capabilities, I'm not the best place to offer the answer.
Well, I guess I'm asking how do we adapt, or how do other Indo-Pacific countries adapt to that problem? But Veerle, I'm very curious on your thoughts on that, if you do have some about how we can manage that problem.
Yeah, I think, we've seen already some management of that problem, and that is that it's going to have to be kind of a pragmatic solution and approach on the part of Europe. It is a reality that not everybody has power projection capabilities to the Indo-Pacific, nor do they necessarily want to join every Indo-Pacific initiative, particularly as it pertains to defense. And that, I think, alludes to a bigger problem, which is that there is still a lack of cohesion on how to address China. The costs that you're willing to incur in Indo-Pacific engagement, and Beijing's reaction to that is very inconsistent still across Europe. And so I think it will have to be under a wider umbrella of an EU strategy, which we've now seen, a pragmatic approach of who can actually project, or deploy to the region and who can already participate in that. We've seen that already, and that's been alluded in plenty of the chapters so far in this report, that in the past we've seen France as a framework kind of nation, sending deployments to the region and having both British and European representatives on board. We've seen previous different formations as well with European partners deploying to the region. So obviously not in a huge or extensive extent, but there has been coordination in some respects. I think it does offer, despite the challenges, it does offer, I think, an interesting opportunity for Europe to participate. So far, I think, in other research that I've done, there have been comments around a slight hesitance of joining, for example, a US-led deployment or initiative in the region, simply because of the more, not controversial, but competitive nature of the US Indo-Pacific strategy, which is, still slightly uncomfortable for some European states. So if there were an opportunity to deploy with European countries, be that under the umbrella of France or the UK, I think that is potentially more comfortable for European countries, but also probably for countries in the region themselves. So I don't necessarily see this as a huge problem in the short to medium term. I think there are frameworks that have already been engaged with. I think also, if we can get over AUKUS in the short to medium term, the UK and France have the Lancaster House treaties. There has been coordination in the past as well. So, there is already precedent for cooperation, particularly naval cooperation in the region, and we can build on that. Long term, of course, that's a different question, and Europe has some serious questions to answer when it comes to strategic autonomy, how it deals with its military capabilities more broadly, and its relationship with the US as well. But that, I think, is another few hours worth of discussion that we can't necessarily get into entirely today. But I would just say that I do hope that looking forward, we can start to see more European initiatives, and the mention that we'll see more German presence as well in the region, I think, is encouraging. And I hope that can be engaged with at an EU member state level, but also with the UK looking ahead.
Well, thank you so much. I think if you want to add something, Rory, that's fine. Yeah.
No, I'll just add, but I mean, the counter-piracy operations in the Indian Ocean and the Gulf of Aden. I think we heard Atlanta mentioned earlier, and the EU and NATO activities in the northwestern Indian Ocean. There actually are precedents, so it may be about expanding the geographic scope of that sort of activity, or indeed it may be about recognising that Europe's going to play a bigger role in the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific, and that's fine. So I don't think we should be too dismayed about that. I think there is something to build on.
Well, thanks so much. And I think that is a lasting impression. There's much to build on. I think that's one of what comes out in the report and what's come out in the discussions today, that European engagement with the Indo-Pacific is essentially embryonic, but that it's well-founded and it's full of promise. And I think the contributions to the report, the platforms such as this, and indeed partnerships between Perth USAsia Centre, Konrad-Adenauer, and similar institutions go a long way to helping to realise that potential, and they need to continue. So on that note, I'd like to throw back to Gordon.
Well, thank you, James, Rory, Lynn, and Veerle. It was a fascinating conversation. It could have gone on easily for another hour. But let me, again, congratulate you, James, on your editing of this excellent volume. We've heard 3 wonderful authors, but that's just a hint of what's in the broader volume. So I'd urge everybody to download and read that, or read it online if you could. It gives you a broader sense, including perspectives from Japan, from India, elsewhere within Europe. Rory, I think, probably feels some sense of satisfaction. He's probably done more to evangelize the term Indo-Pacific than any single individual. And now to see it not just Australia, the US, the region, but Southeast Asia, and now kind of broadly understood as a useful framework for looking at the region in Europe itself, it's got to be satisfying. Look, this project really wouldn't have been possible without our close collaboration with the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung. And to formally close out this event, I'm delighted to be able to turn to Veerle Nouwens, who's the director of the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung's regional program for Australia and the Pacific, to give us some closing remarks. Veerle, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Gordon. Yeah, I'm still based today and in the near future in Berlin, but very much looking forward to be touching Australian soil soon and getting to know the country and the region. Well, I couldn't have put it better than Gordon and James in their last remarks. A terrific outcome of this very compact format, I think. This debate has shown that we're pretty much all on the same page when it comes to analyzing the situation. We are agreeing on very, very many things, like strengthening the rule-based international order in the region, the fact that we need a multifaceted approach to the region, including defense, AI, technology, and other issues. We all agree that the region is moving fast, maybe faster than we all had anticipated. This, to my belief, was also a problem in the misunderstandings and the basically development of AUKUS. I had a chance recently to speak to the Vice Admiral Johnston, who was telling me that basically Australia was also surprised by the speed of development, especially of Chinese defense activities and their basically aim to have a full-fledged submarine fleet sort of in the region, and that for this reason, basically, Australia needed to adapt quickly its stance on these submarines. Yeah, we all agree on the assertiveness of the Chinese stance and approach to the region, and this gives us a great opportunity for the future. I mean, Germany especially is very thankful for anything that we see in recognition of our things that we turned up to present, including the deployment of the frigate Bowen and everything else. I would agree to Rory's assessment that AUKUS, albeit not having been sort of the most diplomatic development, I think it won't change it won't bring us to a fundamental change, but I think that it will bring us all very close to a reality check on our various approaches to the region. Probably the EU stance as well on its aim to sort of balance out the approach in the region and try to avoid sort of getting into the front lines of a US-China standoff. But I think the senses are sharpened now for us all to engage further in the region. We have seen that ASEAN is very welcoming European engagement, as are bilateral relations welcome in the region. So we're all set off on a good path. I guess we have to work on our diplomatic skills maybe a bit. We have to address also overarching problems that we have encountered in this course. Very likely the US-French relation when it comes to these activities, the French idea about independent European strategic approaches. These are all issues that we have to address in the future to be able to sort of, how can I put this, pull on one string, as I might say, with all our collective soft power, because executed in a joint way, our soft powers in the region and everywhere else will bring us closer together and be of importance in shaping our policies in the region. So we must learn our lessons well and learn them fast. I'm very pleased with this debate. Let me, to close out, thank all the panelists at this time and our moderators, James and Gordon. Also, let me thank the excellent colleagues at both the Konrad-Adenauer-Stiftung in Australia, in Canberra, and the Perth USAsia Centre for setting up a wonderful event with participants, from all over the world. Thank you for the audience in having shared us here in our joint debate. We look forward to working continuously with you. My special thanks goes out to David McAllister also in a busy week as we have him in Strasbourg here. Thank you very much for your participation. We look forward to our continuous work with you. And I wish you all a very good remainder of the day and week. Thank you very much.